Start in 5 minutes, so please take your seats. During our event, there will be simultaneous translation available, so if you would like a pair of headphones, then pick them up in the foyer, just outside this Sala Argentina. Feel free to join in the tweeting today. You can find us on Twitter at T20 Solutions. We are also on Facebook under the same name and as T20 Argentina on LinkedIn. Don't forget to use hashtag T20 Argentina if you post something, of course. And thank you very much. In 5 minutes, we will be with you on this first panel of the afternoon.
En 5 minutos. Sí. O sea, ustedes mírenlo. Yo estoy conectado, ¿no? ¿Mm?
Okay, it's 2 o'clock. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoy this morning session as well as your lunch. We will now have our second plenary session of the day, which is on food security and sustainable agriculture. The moderator for this session is Martín Piñeiro, Director of the Agricultural Affairs Committee at CARI. Please welcome him to the stage.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you have had a very good lunch, but I also hope that it was not that good so that you might be sleepy now. So we need to wake up to hear our panelists. As you know, this panel is about food security and nutrition, of food and nutrition security. And as you know, is a very important subject in the international agenda. United Nations has, at several occasions, declared, or in declarations, have recognized it as a human right. But still, in spite of that, there's still hunger in the world. Probably around 1 billion people are still improperly fed. The world did a lot of improvements in the first 15 years of this century, and hunger or food insecurity decreased probably to maybe 800 million. But in the last 2 years, it has again increased. And the expectations is, and the figures from FAO, that we're back at 1 billion. So something is not going totally right. It is obvious that we're not doing sufficiently worldwide to eliminate hunger in the world. We have, of course, food security has a lot to do with national policies, but of course also to global collective action. And this is what the G20 deals with. So this is the question we will be asking today. What can the G20 do to improve food security worldwide and in the individual countries together with national governments? I think we have an excellent panel to deal with this subject, to have a dialogue around this subject. Let me introduce them in the order in which they are. Máximo, they're sitting from here to the left. Máximo Torero, who is Executive Director of the World Bank, in representation of several countries, including Peru of his nationality, Argentina, and a number of others. Valeria Piñeiro, who is Research Coordinator in IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute. Belay Begashaw, who's Director General of the Sustainable Goals Development Center for Africa, and Manuel Otero, who's Director General of the El Instituto Interamericano para la Cooperación para la Agricultura, the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation in Agriculture, sorry for the mistake, who will dialogue and answer some questions. We will start, and that's the agreement, that I will ask a very general question, which, however, requires very specific answers. And the question is, from your perspective, what are the 1 or 2 collective actions that you would recommend that the G20 adopts to end global food security and malnutrition? The 4 panelists will address this question in the order in which they're sitting, and then we will discuss other questions that will come after. So Máximo, please, if you could start.
Thank you very much, Martin. I don't know if you hear me. So let me first say that I am here in a personal basis. I'm not representing the board of the World Bank, neither the World Bank. So everything I said is my fault and my errors are mine. Given said that, let me put things in context. I think that in the case of food security, we must achieve a balancing act. And that balancing act has basically three main elements that we need to cover to be able to feed 9 million people by 2050. First, we have to close the food gap. And what this means that we have to increase production in 60% by 2050 or 50% by 2030. And the only way we can increase production is by increasing productivity because we have a constraint of land. So that means that we have to increase total factor productivity of agriculture. The problem is that we do a map today of the world where the food is being produced. It's not where we have the major problems of hunger and malnutrition, which is mostly sub-Saharan Africa and some Asian countries. So we need to focus on that to be able to reduce this and close this food gap. The second element is to support the economic development. And why is this? Because 28% of the population is directly or indirectly employed by agriculture, and 40% of those are females. And if we add to that the technological innovation that we are living of automatization today, that would put a constraint, and we need to be ready for that. And the final element, or the final balancing act that we need to take care is reducing environmental impact, where 24% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture. So how we resolve and be able to resolve these three elements that we need to balance to be able to move forward in a food security agenda. What I believe within the G20 collaboration mechanism, there are several things and several priorities, and here comes the two priorities that you requested. First, on closing the food gap, it's clear to me that with the demand growing at around 50% and an available land at around 28%, the only solution is increasing productivity. And that's where we need to put our efforts, and that's where we need to put our emphasis. But at the same time, we need to be able to do it sustainable. Now, the MACs, the Meeting of Agricultural Chief Scientists, are supposed to come up with a public good through the G20 to be able to identify where are the best practices that we could use, and we can learn South-South learning or North-South learning to be able to increase productivity in developing countries, and at the same time to make it in a sustainable way. And they have initiatives like, for example, the Agricultural Technology Sharing, the ATS, and the Agroecological Living Labs, all, which they need to be empowered. So the first element for me is finding mechanisms to reduce the constraints to be able to move up productivity and to increase efficiency. The second element is encourage open, efficient, and fair trading systems, but incorporating the cost of key externalities like water and GHG, so green gas emissions. We need to find ways to price those externalities within the trading system to be able to achieve that third balancing act of reducing GHG emissions, complying with an increase in productivity. And for that, we need to do a lot of work. For example, in pricing water, we have not done too much. Then there are two other elements that I think, and which we have been working through the food security arm of the T20, which are linked to something that could be done in the short term, in some cases, and in some cases in the medium and long term. This is reducing food loss and waste, and please be careful that I am separating what is loss to what is waste. Waste is at the final consumer side. Food loss occurs across the value chain. And the other element is access to input markets. These are two core elements that will help not only to improve efficiency of production and to get closer to the potential frontier and increase productivity, but in the case of waste, it will also reduce emissions and will make us to use more efficiently the food we have in place. So what we need to do, first, we need to measure and have a good baseline, and then put clear targets. The MDGs have clear targets, but we need to have a very good baseline with a common methodology that allows us to identify the problems in the food loss part, so that we can figure out where the problems are, and then identify where the waste is and how we can use best practices like efficient food banks or other mechanisms that will allow us to reduce food waste. Because then we are using the food in a more efficient way on the waste side, but on the losses side, we are also increasing efficiency and total factor productivity. And finally, on the input side, we have issued a brief on fertilizers, where basically brings up the problem of the global markets and how concentrated the global markets are in terms of the supply of fertilizers. Very few countries control most of the supply or the exports of fertilizers to the world. And that makes that regions like sub-Saharan Africa, for example, have to face very high prices, which didn't allow them to have the penetration or the access that they need to be able to increase productivity. The same applies for the side of seeds. So we need to find ways, innovative ways, to be able to reduce that level of concentration that will allow us to have better access to those markets. So, in summary, the recommendations for me will be increase TFP in a sustainable way, be able to encourage free trade markets, valuing the externalities, and reduce food loss and waste, and also increase competition in the input markets. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Máximo. And very good timing, exactly 5 minutes. Valeria, Piñeiro.
Well, first of all, thank you, the T20 organizers for the invitation, CPEC and CARI, and thank you, my colleagues here in the panel. I think that Máximo covered quite a lot of things, so I would just like to add one thing to what Máximo said, or more than anything, emphasize one thing, that it is measurement. It would be very nice, as Máximo mentioned, to have a very good measure of TFP, total factor productivity in the agricultural sector, but including what it is natural resources. So it's what Máximo has been saying about adding the, measuring completely the cost, including the natural resources into the equation. And also, once that we're there, also we can maybe even think of a way of rethinking or realignment the subsidies. So we're talking about production in a sustainable way, where there are many use of subsidies that are not put it in the right things for the right causes in terms of the use and management of the natural resources. Then I will jump to another point of view, that it is, if we're more looking at just food insecurity and malnutrition, if those are our goals, there are some background maybe information that I will give to pinpoint to my recommendation at the end, that it is, the world is facing a wave of protectionism that is complicating the multilateral trade system. And also, given the last ministerial conference, the WTO MC, that it was here in Buenos Aires, that also left us with no real consensus of the road ahead of us. There's also trade that plays a very important role in food deficit countries, helping them with the food availability, and also it can help promote more diversified diets, that they will at least cover one of the points of malnutrition, one of the components of malnutrition. Then literature always says that open and predictable trade policies have the potential to reduce the negative impacts of food security and also give some stability to the markets. With this, we will need good rules, and providing disciplines on imports and export restrictions aim to stabilize the domestic market. This is just the insulation policies, not so much for extreme measures that sometimes are needed. And then another key point here is that the countries that make up the G20 account for 60% of the world's agricultural land, more or less 80% of the global agricultural trade, and about 2/3 of the global population. This gives these countries a very important role to play in terms of global food security. So, for one side, we have that the G20 should assume a more proactive role with regard to the future of the WTO and the reform. And earlier today, for example, in the task force number 7, there was a big discussion about the communique and the reform, if we call it reform or modernization, but there is something that needs to be done in this sense. And then on the other hand, we have the Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations, which also is pushing for sustainability to be the core principle of global cooperation, which is international trade, one of them. So I think that the G20 can play a big role in bridging the gap between the realities in the international trade system and the goals from the SDGs in a complex challenge that either of those can do by themselves. So even the WTO by itself or the United Nations can't do it separately. So we need to find maybe a gap in between them to really accomplish the problem of food security. And then in terms of the short-term suggestion, I think that it will be very interesting to ensure that the relevance of trade for sustainable food future remains a priority in the upcoming presidency for the G20 of Japan 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Belay, your turn.
Thank you very much. Let me echo my colleagues here and thanks the organizers for giving us this wonderful opportunity to come and share our challenges and our views on agriculture, food security, and nutrition. I came from Africa, where over 65% of the African farmers represented by subsistence mixed farming system. The subsistence mixed farming in Africa contributes 90% of actually agriculture for production. As you know, this system is low input, low output, low investment. And the subsistence system is a system that relies by and large on nature to produce food and to run the livelihood. One important thing that we need to take into account is it is absolutely naive to think that agriculture is a single enterprise in Africa in this actually system. It is a livelihood. It is everything. It is a source of food. It is a source of feed. It is a source of soil fertility. It is a source of energy. That's where fire is coming from. So it's a source of everything. It's not only at the micro level. It's not only at the household level. When it comes to the macro level, also the same thing. The government in Africa, most governments are expecting agriculture to contribute for food, to contribute for export, to contribute for income in terms of taxes and all these things. So what does this mean? This means there is huge trade-off and tense relationship between different interests and how actually you can plan right agriculture production and productivity, both at macro and at household levels. If you see at macro level, if you are expecting an economic optimum or economic return from export, which is not necessarily be the case, works for household, because the household is more interested on financial return rather than on economic return, then there is always a mismatch. And that's why we are saying that this agriculture is trying to survive within that kind of trade-off systems. So in this reality, definitely there are few issues that we need to work on. The first one is the major challenge now is productivity. Agriculture productivity per hectare, per unit, per livestock, is very, very low because for the reason that I mentioned. But on the other hand, research shows that within the existing technology level around farmers and at the national and macro levels, we could increase agriculture production by 50% in agriculture without any sophistication. Why we can't do that? Because we have not aligned the incentive system properly. The issue is scaling. Scaling is about finance. Scaling is about making available resources to people so that they can actually invest. So those provisions are not around. And in the absence of those provisions, farmers who are actually getting hit from drought and flood every other year, and who don't have actually enough resources to survive, can't actually invest that level of money in order to transform agriculture into commercial levels. So this is one area that we really want to put it as a recommendation. The second important thing is the existing financing system. We call actually for the new order of finance when it comes to agriculture and particularly smallholder agriculture, because the existing finance mechanism is not embracing that kind of fragmented credit or any kind of system. For that, definitely we have to find out how we can align these incentives, helping to invest through incentive for the long-term rewarding kind of investments, including resource-based intervention that most of the agriculture system is lacking right now. The other important thing in Africa, if we have to make a breakthrough in agriculture, particularly taking into account the high vulnerability and variability of climate issues around, adaptation should be an agenda. Right now, this agenda seems off, from major forums. We haven't seen actually a dedicated track, even in the COP 21, 22. Since COP 17, we haven't seen actually adaptation, agriculture as a major way of adaptation discussed as a track. We need to reconvene this. We need to bring adaptation as a major agenda. For Africa, it is the single most critical factor of adaptation, again, is water. And we need to make green water available. We need to invest on water, and we need to push the adaptation agenda. This is what we need from the G20 as a recommendation. The last factor is demographic factor. I think if we don't really have this into consideration on every single planning that we are doing for transforming agriculture in Africa, we would not be able to address the demand side of the question. So the demographic factor is critical. We need to work on this. We need to help actually in several ways, including family planning or all other aspects of demographic factors in order to bring the breakthrough that we are seeking. And one final remark is inclusiveness. It is extremely important. The value chain that we are putting together for transforming agriculture through building resilience system has to have an element of inclusiveness at all levels, through governance, incomes, and everything. Without that, perhaps we will not be able to achieve what we are aiming here. Thank you.
Thank you, Belay. Manuel?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers. Before making any concrete proposal, I would like to share with you some elements of the situation and perspectives of the Latin America and the Caribbean region. And let me share with you a very good news. And the very good news is that this region has everything to become a key actor for ensuring food security and worldwide sustainability. Having said that, I have to recognize that when I put a magnifying glass on this aggregate vision, undoubtedly it emerges some clear differences. On one side, we have the southern cone countries that they are some sort of locomotive, and this makes a difference with the Caribbean countries, with some Central American countries like Honduras, El Salvador, and obviously Venezuela. They are the subgroup of net food importers, that they are, most of them at the same time, extremely vulnerable to the climatic change. There is a pending agenda, and Máximo mentioned, for example, the case of productivity. In Latin America and the Caribbean region, we have the same problem. If you compare, for example, the yields in the case of corn, we have 3 times less yields in South America compared with Canada. The productivity per agriculture worker, if we compare, once again, Canada or US with Latin American countries, we are lagged behind, so productivity is a very serious problem. The other problem that it was already mentioned is the exposure to the climate change. Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominican Republic, and all Eastern Caribbean states are very vulnerable to the climate change. There is also a problem that there is the lack of vision for implementing long-term agriculture policies. And last but not least, the main obsession in Latin America and the Caribbean region is how to produce more. And seems to me we need a shift in the paradigm in order to think how to produce more and produce better, introducing the nutritional dimension, which is practically ignored. In terms of the proposal, it seems to me that we should have to join efforts to unleash the huge potential we have in the tropical agriculture sub-region. This program, in the case of Latin America and Caribbean that has a tropical agriculture sector, should have to be supported by two pillars. One is the pillar of the research and development. We are not investing enough. We don't have enough researchers. Most of them are very high age. So we need to make renewed efforts rethinking the role of the national research institutes. And the other pillar should have to be related with trade and integration. Trade and integration. There are some good signals paying attention concerning some movements between Pacific Alliance and Mercosur, the fact that Mexico is apparently getting closer to Brazil and Argentina. We need to speed up this process and try to wake up the sleeping giant that we have in the Americas if we want to be key actors looking at the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuel. Well, we have had a very good round of this first question. Now the idea is that we will put in the screen 3 other possible questions, and I will ask the panelists to pick one, anyone or more than one, to make again a presentation or a statement of not more than 5 minutes. And maybe we can go in the same order so that Manuel can recuperate, has time to recuperate.
Okay, so let me be very concrete. I will talk about 2 of them on trade, and I will be very brief on trade because I'm sure Valeria will talk more on trade. The first thing is that 1/5 of the food is traded. The calories are traded in the world, which makes trade extremely important. And there is where we go into the discussion of self-sufficiency versus accessibility to food. Trade allows us to have access to food in locations where we cannot have self-sufficiency. And the idea is to be efficient in using the resources. So that's why it's so important to avoid the type of trade wars that we are facing today, which the only thing they are doing, like today, for example, the soybeans market is facing excessive volatility because of what is happening between the US and China moving completely to purchase from Brazil. So we need to avoid that noise in the market, which is unnecessarily and increasing efficiencies. And we need to find ways in the governance to improve. WTO needs to improve. And what was mentioned this morning by Mr. Ocampo makes a lot of sense. We need to find ways in which we can rebalance the power based on the levels of trade, imports and exports of the countries so that we have better voice and we can make a more efficient use of the rules that we have in place in WTO. So there I think the G20 can play a role. Of course, WTO has to play a role, but I clearly think that we need to improve our governance. Now, let me move to the private sector, which I think is extremely important. Why? Because basically, to be able to accomplish the SDGs, we need around $480 billion. And today, we are investing around 220. So the difference is the gap, and that's the gap that we need to cover. And the only way we can cover that gap of investment to be able to accomplish those SDGs is with the private sector. Now, for the private sector to play a role, we need to put some rules of the game, and very clear rules of the game. And that will require stability and transparency in policies. It will require clear incentives. And here is where distortions could affect things. Although OECD countries have improved and reduced the level of distortions, still they are very high. And the change is not moving in the direction that we should do. And many emerging economies are increasing the levels of distortions. So we need to improve the rules of the game, and we need to minimize those distortions to allow the private sector to play, because they want to play in a fair game. And that's where the institutions need to be strong. We need to improve market access, and here is where infrastructure is crucial, and that's the public good that the governments can play. So the idea is to combine public and private sector. The private sector will need investments from the public sector and to have these basic institutions. But infrastructure requires investment, and that's what reduces also inequality. So we need to find ways in which we can increase investment in infrastructure, hard infrastructure, but also soft infrastructure. And when I refer to soft infrastructure, I'm referring on research and development, extension services, and standards and phytosanitary mechanisms. And that's where FAO, for example, could play a crucial role. On hard infrastructure, the World Bank or the MDBs could play a crucial role because they are the ones that can reduce this gap, bringing together the private sector. And the last topic, which is extremely important for the private sector, is human capital. We are moving in a huge velocity on technological innovation. Automatization is huge. In Argentina, if you go where grapes are being produced, you have machines which are automatically harvesting. And that's displacing labor. The advantage is that you can operate 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days of the week, which allows you to have your harvest in the best optimal time. So how are we going to prepare the human capital to be able to respond to that automatization? And we cannot waste time. And that's something that governments can play a role, because it will also benefit the private sector to have the human capital with the skills that they need to be able to move and invest in agriculture. So again, it's crucial, the role of the private sector, but we need to have clear rules of the game to make this possible, and the governments need to play a substantial role. This cannot be alone, they have to be together. Thank you.
Thank you, Máximo. Valeria?
Well, I'm glad Máximo didn't talk too much about trade, because that's the question I'm going to pick, which is the role of trade in eliminating global hunger and malnutrition. So the part of malnutrition is key thing here as well. So as Máximo said, international trade is definitely taking an increasing share. The share, for example, of produced calories crossing an international border has increased from 16% to 20% in the last 20 years. And also, the number of countries that participate in trade has also increased by more than 3 times. So it is important that all countries are able to secure the availability and affordability of food, but not only food, nutritious food. And for that, it is very important to have a diversified access food. And at the same time, it is important to make sure that the agricultural production is done in a sustainable way. So we have these two issues here, sustainable production, and at the same time, a diversified and nutritious diet. So the trade agreements and regulations should aim to reduce and eliminate any restrictions that go against these desired outcomes, while at the same time, they should give these incentives for trade and nutritious and sustainable produced foods. With this, what I mean is that they will need to be thinking about allowing some kind of restrictions in terms of non-tariff barriers, in terms of product standards, and at the same time labeling, or the other way around, to disincentivize the trading of these products that do not qualify with the standards that they were already agreed. So what's the action here is that the G20, as a key part of the global governance architecture, should collaborate and coordinate this initiative to promote the good outcomes and to avoid the possibility of countries starting to impose their own trade barriers, to saying that it is in terms of this. So it will be necessarily to be scientific based and not coordinated with other countries. If they don't do that, there will be definitely higher cost and efficiencies in the trade system that will go against these 2 objectives that we had, which is to produce in a sustainable way and at the same time provide a nutritious food for everyone. So I think that we're further away to agreeing on nutritional standards. We're still talking about labeling. Some countries are starting to think about labeling food in terms of the nutrition content of each of them. But countries should start moving in that direction, and the G20 should definitely start defining the proper direction. Also with this, we can also start giving the right incentives to producers and to the food industry to as well start investing in things that will go again towards the 2 objectives that we had. I think that this is very hard to do country by country. There's a lot of political reasons that will complicate things a little bit, but if we start collaborating and thinking as a bloc, I think that we can start thinking in the right direction, and maybe in many, many years to come, there will be a good solution to this.
Thank you, Valeria. Belay?
Thank you. I'm focusing on the private sector first. I mean, when I talk about the private sector, I'm with anticipation that the private sector with a better capacity for investment, a private sector which is also willing to do things responsibly. I think these 2 things are very critical. From the continent I came from, knowing that the majority of the people are in production, I don't think it is, the private sector will have comparative advantage in engaging itself in the production as such. I would rather suggest that if the private sector is investing on the infrastructure, investing on irrigation capacities, investing on the biotechnology services, investing on certain things that the smallholder farmers and the medium holder farmers could benefit at the same time, contribute to their livelihood and also lifting them out from the quagmire situation that they are into. So from this perspective, I think the private sector has enormous opportunity involving in input and output marketing. The private sector can be a very good outway for apex market, particularly the international market. This is not something that smallholders in a fragmented way could be competitive enough. So I think if we link this process, then we will have a win-win, the private sector and the smallholder farmers. In order to be able to have a functioning environment on this one, we definitely need a strong regulatory system. We need standards, we need working, basically commercial laws and regulations, and we need strong reinforcement on contractual systems. We need to enforce everything that is actually help building the trust and confidence of the international market requires. So without that, it will be very difficult actually to expect that kind of a breakthrough and penetration, particularly in building a competitive market system. The other very important thing the regulatory system could play is, as Máximo said, the phytosanitary, zoosanitary, and all other standards that the ISO standards are requiring, particularly in delivering healthy and sanitation food system. If a country doesn't have that, if the country is not in compliance with that, no one would be interested to have any business with. This is our experience. And nobody is expecting a disease-free country or a disease-free zone or a disease-free production. Everybody is expecting, if disease occurs, how quick the country could respond, how quick the country could trace that problem, how efficient that system is. So that is the kind of thing that the government has to put in place in order to support the private sector to function the way I suggested. Thank you.
Thank you, Belay. Manuel?
Yes, I will accompany Belay picking up the question related with the private sector. And I would like to begin defending the role of the farmers, since farmers are the largest investors within the farm gate. We need to protect the farmers in the sense that we have to take into consideration profitability and also implement policies in order to manage risks. In the same token, the provision of public goods are essential in order the farmers stimulate investment on the farm. I'm referring to research, extension, access to land, especially rural infrastructure, irrigation, to mention a few. Latin American and the Caribbean countries is one of the most inefficient regions worldwide in terms of what happens out of the farm gate. Just to give you an example, the logistical cost in Central America represents 40% of the total cost, whereas in Chile is 18% and OECD countries 8%. Public partnership represents a very good alternative, especially for making investment in rural infrastructure and also in the area of research. As you know, research in Latin America and the Caribbean region is represented practically 90% by public sector, and up to now, private sector is just making very marginal investment. Fortunately, the PPP approach is spreading across the countries, regardless their ideologies, and this is a very good news. In terms of be propositive, seems to me that in some countries, local markets are very small. We should have to open our minds and try to think in terms of regional markets, trying to share public regulations. For example, in the case of intellectual property, in the area of seed laws, product standards, trying to benefit some technology input firms, looking ahead at the regional markets instead to be isolated in local markets. Once again, PPP is fundamental for infrastructure, transportation, and research and innovation. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Manuel. From these magnificent comments and interventions, I read 5 main recommendations for the G20. 1, take great care and with a global perspective on increasing production and productivity, because if not, we will not meet the growing demand. 2nd, we need better and more transparent trade as an instrument for alleviating hunger with a global perspective. More dialogue and cooperation with the private sector, but at the same time, stronger regulatory systems, especially in relation to global standards on labeling, on questions related to safety of food. And finally, more attention to the elements of malnutrition, the relationship and the connection between malnutrition and diseases. Of course, obesity, which was not very specifically mentioned here, but is one of the main things. We do have still like 5 or 6 minutes, so I would dare to ask one difficult question, especially if one thinks it in a global sense. There was very little comment in regards to access to food. The perspective you presented was mainly from the production side and the things we need to ensure that food is available physically to consumers. But you said nothing about access, the capacity to buy food, which is related to poverty, to rural poverty, urban poverty, to income distribution, inequalities, inclusion. Would anybody want to make a comment on that? Belay first, and then Máximo. Belay.
No, I think that's a very important thing. I try to touch on that when I talk about inclusiveness and demographic factors, because these are the demand side of the question. But it's extremely important to understand that you can be food secure at national level, but you can't be food secure unless you secure access at household and individual levels. So this gap is very clear. There are many countries in Africa who claims that they are actually food secure at national level, but their people are still starving. So I think I suggest 2 things. First, this is how and where we can align incentive. We can actually do some kind of measures that help bridge that food insecurity gap for the moment, while they are investing for tomorrow's future. The safety net program, the productive safety net kind of thing that we are advocating everywhere now is the best bridging mechanisms. The second important thing is we have to start thinking about social spending. We have to see how we can raise actually the minimum wage in each country. We have to see how actually for certain, particularly the bottom 20% of the population, that we will have some kind of mechanism that work as a subsidy to support this, which is a different way of, social security fund that is happening in other social democratic systems.
Thank you, Belay. Máximo?
Yeah, so only to add, I think when we were talking about trade, we were talking of availability of food, and you're completely correct. That food is available for countries that cannot produce and which is not efficient in some cases to produce, doesn't mean that they will be able to buy it. And that's where income is important. But we need to look at income not only at the first moment, which is absolute levels of income, but we also need to look at inequality at the second moment. And that's where the problem comes, because free trade will imply winners and losers, and there will be losers that won't be able to have access. And that's where we need to put policies in place. And that's where data, proper targeting is crucial, trying to identify the sectors that are being affected, which are the populations that are being affected, and how we can target them through appropriate safety nets mechanisms like conditional transfers or other mechanisms of transfers, but at the same time how we can provide them tools so that they can potentiate their human capital, and that's where the nutrition part is crucial. If we are not investing in nutrition in the first 1,000 days, then we are affecting the lives of these kids for the future. And they won't be able to get access to income, to be able to purchase food, and to be able to be part and reduce their malnutrition. So education is also crucial in this case, and it also applies to overnutrition, which is another problem, the famous triple burden, not only double burden, but we could have families that are overweight, and at the same time in the same family you have kids which are completely undernourished. Or we can even have in both a woman or a female which is overweight but with anemia. So we need to find ways and mechanisms to target policies to minimize those risks. And that's where we need to figure out the ways to reduce not only the lack of access, but also reduce the inequality. And one of the tools for governments that clearly is shown that reducing inequality is also investment in infrastructure, which also benefits flow of goods.
Manuel and Valeria have asked to talk, and we have exactly 4 minutes. So 2 minutes each, please.
During many times, food security has been just correlated to production. Now everybody agrees that this is a complex equation in which besides production, you have to take into consideration access, distribution. So it's very easy to tell this, but very difficult to put in practice. In any event, we need macroeconomic stability, we need economic growth, we need long-term sectorial policies, we need social policies focused, directed to the most vulnerable groups. We need a lot of interinstitutional coordination, which is something very difficult to implement, and obviously more open and more integrated economies.
Thank you, Manuel. Valeria?
Well, the beauty of being last is that everything was already said. So I just want to add one more thing, is that, yes, when we talked about trade, it was just the availability of the food, as everybody said. But just to add is, if we want to talk about not only availability, but access and affordability, that's when you cannot make a general comment about the global situation of everything. Each country, it is different. Some of them may be, the problem will be the access. So they have bottlenecks, they have problems with the infrastructure or things like that. Some other countries are just the income and income inequality that it is actually giving them the problem of the affordability. So I think that to answer that question, we will need to go into more detail about exactly what countries and what we're talking about.
Thank you very much.
Only one little comment, which I think a topic that we have not touched too much and which affects all of the topics we have touched, is global governance of food security. I think there is a failure in the global governance of food security, and the G20 can play a role to improve the specialization of the entities, the UN agencies, the MDBs, and to improve in how we are more efficient and accountable in what we deliver. I think the food crisis shows how we failed in terms of global governance, and I think we cannot waste the opportunity to improve that, and the G20 can play an important role in that.
Thank you very much. Just to end with a commercial, in the sense that within the T20 exercise, there was a task force 3, which was food security and sustainable agriculture, that they prepared 7 briefs in which many of these questions were addressed, and some very specific recommendations to the G20 are presented. So if you were interested in the discussion, I suggest and recommend that you read at least some of the briefs. Thank you very
right after this is one of the parallel sessions that we talked about
immediately
productivity.
after, we have a parallel panel about that, and tomorrow the other one. So let me thank the panelists very much for your presentations and interventions, and let me say, accompany me with the
Thank you very much, Martín Piñeiro. This was an interesting session on food